Hello, I'm Andre Farrar and this is my Dice Talk. Well, good evening. Lovely to be here. I am indeed Andre Farrar and I worked for the RSPB for a million years. This is not going to be a text-heavy academic thing. I always think sometimes there are too many words on slides. If I wanted you to read, I'll send you an email. So it's lovely to see you all. I was young once. I started working for the RSPB in 1982, so my conservation involvement goes back to the late 70s, which is prehistory, but there is going to be a little bit of history in this. I am of a certain age that I think a little bit of biography is inevitable in a talk like this. Anyway, I started with the RSPB, then I ended up doing a lot of media work, and I was sort of head windbag for many years. Here I am talking about bird flu. Very topical these days, but this was 18 years ago. And then I graduated to being allowed to lobby politicians, and here's me mansplaining to Angela Eagle about the problems building an airport in the Thames estuary would cause. Oh my God, still got the same hat. There we are, yes, frugal if nothing else. And then I retired. Get closer to nature, they said. And so since 2018, I've been doing all the various things that Bob alluded to, including rescuing the odd daft swan that gets stranded on the A28. But I want to focus this evening on the work that happens to protect our special places for wildlife. That's one strand of conservation, and I'll come back to the context later on. But why is that important? Well, the UK, and this is very much a UK, indeed southeast of the UK focused thing, is at the heart of that green octopus that straddles the Europe and parts of the Arctic, which is known as the East Atlantic Flyway. And it's this network of migratory routes that link up all sorts of important sites from southern Africa right the way up to Arctic Canada and across into Siberia and all points in between. And by a little bit of luck and a lot of hard work, the UK has retained, largely intact, a lot of its coastal wetlands. And that's relatively unusual if you look around the world. I mean, California lost 90% of its coastal wetlands in historic times. I bet they could do with them now. And around the Mediterranean, down the coast of China, coastal wetlands have disappeared hand over fist. So why is it being different in the UK? Well, I'll explore that a little bit. So my background was very varied, and I had one chunk of time as a conservation officer with RSPB doing what we call casework, the stuff that involves stopping bad things happening to our most important wildlife sites. So that's a picture of the Mersey estuary. Apologies for the lights, apparently they're broken, so you just have to look through the gloom. The Mersey estuary, which is one of those coastal wetlands. It was so polluted in the 1960s that it was pretty much abiotic, nothing lived in it. And then it started to improve a little bit, and a few ducks found it to their taste. And then from the early 80s, there was a lot of work put in to clean the Mersey up to such an extent that salmon and seals eventually returned to it. This was at a time when the UK was getting over the tag of being the dirty man of Europe, when our rivers were incredibly polluted, and our reputation worldwide was sullied by the state of our waterways. I'd like to say things did improve. I'd like to say they stayed improved. They sadly haven't, but that's a whole other story. So the Mersey was improving, life was coming back to it, and then there was a proposal to build a tidal power generating barrage across it, which would have pretty much seen the end of the Mersey estuary as an important site for wildlife. And I spent 3 or 4 years of my life trying to tackle that proposal, and we've had 3 or 4 newer versions of that proposal. They've all been seen off, partly because of the absurd economics of building large tidal power generating barrages, but also because of the environmental impact, both upstream and downstream. Some of the birds that are important on the Mersey, these are pintail, type of duck, dunlin, internationally important for dunlin, and these are species that need healthy mud with food in it. So it was a real signal that the Mersey was improving and the quality of it was coming back again. But fighting off these proposals is all well and good, and conservation organisations like the RSPB and many of the other campaigning conservation bodies pile into a piece of casework and get involved in all the details, all the legals, all the campaigning, all the resources building up for it, and very often engaging the local community in helping to fight the threat off. And then sometimes, very often, the threat is fought off, and then all the conservation organisations disappear off over the horizon to the next battle, leaving the community going, well, where did they go? I thought you said it was special. Where are you now? Now we need you. What's going to happen next? And of course, in that vacuum, what happens is the damaging proposal usually comes back again in a few years' time. So this endless treadmill of fighting battles was incredibly frustrating. So we developed that into campaigning around why our coastal estuaries and wetlands are so important. What's the context? Why should local authorities and the bodies responsible for them care and take them into account? And during the 1980s, early 90s, we made huge progress around the Thames, and particularly up in my patch of northwest England, of achieving recognition that these coastal wetlands were really important. There's still echoes of that there now. I haven't lost that entirely, but it was a period of real progress, of real hope, and of real integration with the economic plans of the regions that had these important estuaries. Another important site that I was involved with was this one. That's Thorne Moors on the Yorkshire-Lincolnshire border. And the scale of that is astronomical. That's a whole landscape. I don't know if we've got a pointer, it doesn't really matter, you can barely see it anyway, but the road that goes across the middle of it has got peat piled up against it, and that's about to be packaged up and taken away for use in the horticultural industry. Now, this was a battle we were fighting 35, 40 years ago, which we won. Thorne Moors was saved. The peat mining activities were stopped, and it's now a thriving wetland again. But we have not won the longer battle to stop using horticultural peat. So there's always this balance between the fight to save a site and the broader policy context. And there's times when that policy context feels like it's going in the right direction. And then, indeed, I did have policy colleagues who used to say, oh, we don't need to worry about protecting sites because the policy mechanisms will be there to save them. Ha, we went at the time. And I think we were right. The battles, sadly, still continue. Thorne Moors is important for this bird, which is a nightjar, for those of you who don't know. And there's some ornithological colleagues in the audience, so I hope you don't feel I'm talking down to you when I identify the birds, but that's a nightjar. A nocturnal species, it's a migrant to Britain, doing quite well in some areas. There's actually a survey of them this year in Kent and everywhere else, so we'll know how many we've got down here. But on Thorne and Hatfield, this was a really important species. So a little bit of history. Two elderly gentlemen, one of whom, perhaps both of whom you recognise, Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee, Prime Minister during the war and just afterwards. And during the war, so 80 years ago we're talking about now, the vision developed for the land and the landscapes and the special places that we have here. And these came into being in the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act in 1949, which brought into being the national parks and the protected area network that we now recognise, at least by name. These sites of special scientific interest, the designation, the scientific designation that recognises some places are better than others for wildlife. So this was a huge step forward, but it was still only paper parks. These were still only protections in law only. They didn't really mean that much on the ground. And that's a picture of a reservoir in Upper Teesdale called Cal Green, which went ahead despite the protest of botanists, knowing that the area was one of the most important sites in Britain for plants. But there wasn't the planning context, there wasn't the campaigning heft to save these sites from damaging developments. So the botany under Cal Green Reservoir disappeared. And in that period, after the war and into the 1960s and 70s, we did have a network of protected areas, sites that were identified for being important, but they were being damaged and destroyed at a rate of something like 12% a year. So it was meaningless, it was pointless protection. And in the 1970s, it was a very depressing time when the great lists were being published of the losses of our habitats, the 95% of our upland hay meadows, the 95% of our lowland raised mires, like Thorn and Hatfield Moors. These litanies of loss that were being published through the 70s were very depressing. And the conservation organisations at the time were not up to the task, frankly. They were fiddling while the countryside burned. It took a sort of revolution in terms of policy and in terms of planning to start to win some of those battles. And part of that was the fact that the UK joined the common market, the European common market. And yes, I know I keep everything. I keep far too much. These are the original brochures from the original referendum to which confirmed our membership of the common market. And the common market came with rules that you shouldn't trash your natural environment to get a competitive advantage over your neighbour. And campaigners at the time, this was before my time, my first vote actually was the referendum, we've got the opportunity here to use this market mechanism to start to apply some effective legislation. And the European legislation that came through in the form of the 1979 Wild Birds Directive transformed things. They transformed the nature of our protection, particularly for birds, as the name of it implies, but also to start to beef up our sites of special scientific interest. Because the Wildlife and Countryside Act had to come into being to bring into UK law that European legislation. So we now had European legislation driving changes to British legislation and practice, cleaning up things like the Mersey estuary, applying effective mechanisms to protect our best wildlife sites. And for the tippy top ones, the ones of European standard, they were qualifying for this thing called the Natura 2000 series, a term that never caught on in the UK. So take Natura 2000 to naturalists, they don't know what you mean. In Europe, it's a bit of a Michelin star for the quality of the best wildlife sites in Europe. And we had all this, and then we didn't. As an aside, I spent, when I was campaigning for protected areas, one of my jobs was to write a promotional booklet for the 30th anniversary version of the Wild Birds Directive. I got some great jobs. And part of that was because in Europe, the whole thing was coming under pressure to be reformed and reviewed, huge economic pressure to weaken the laws that protected nature. And RSPB and the BirdLife Partnership across Europe mobilised our membership and concerned people about concerned conservation individuals. And the public consultation around this review in Europe, which normally attracted 20 or 30 responses if they were lucky, gathered over 500,000 across Europe, which had never before been seen by the European Union. So that balance of scientific evidence, well-presented campaigning arguments and public pressure was very effective in protecting the nature directives in Europe. We then left Europe, so it didn't really help us very much, but hey, at least we won the battle. Some of the places locally in Kent are some of the most designated sites in the world. This is an aerial view of Dungeness. An enormously important area for wildlife, not just birds, lots of plants and invertebrates are found there and rarely anywhere else. So it's a tremendously important area, and it's got all the international designations you could wish, but it's still got a nuclear power station in the middle of it. The public inquiry for that in the 1960s lasted 2 days. There we are, a strange landscape. Some people love it, some people are not so keen, but it's a great place for nature, for enjoying nature and for conservation. But it's bruised and battered. In the 1930s, the Romney High, the Dymchurch Light Railway if you ever fancy a strange day out, go down to Hythe and catch the tiny train to Dungeness. It's very uncomfortable and quite expensive, but good fun. But that, of course, was built across a pristine coastal environment. So over the decades, Dungeness has been beaten and bashed about, but it is still there and it's still highly important. It used to support this bird, which is the Kentish plover, and its only breeding haunt in the United Kingdom. Those disappeared in the years after the Second World War from a variety of reasons. Probably a bit of predation, certainly a bit of egg collector pressure, and just the sheer disturbance and development pressure that was going on the area. So we're always fighting these battles over decades to protect these areas. You win, but you never win forever. There's always the next battle to come. But while we've lost some species, others have come in. And our protected area network is designated usually for species that it's defined for. It isn't just because it's a nice place. Usually the citation for a designation specifies what species it's important for. But in a time of climate change, we're seeing species distributions moving. So one of the arguments against defending protected areas is, well, everything's moving. You can't keep the designations where they are. But it turns out that these important areas are intrinsically important because when species like this great white egret start to colonize, the climate refugees from further south in Europe, when they start to colonize, it tends to be not in the middle of a field of wheat that they appear, but on these protected areas. And just one for the birders in the audience. Dungeness is the first and so far only location in the UK where purple herons nested. So these places are really important for stepping stones for species that are moving under the pressure of climate change. But the threats keep coming. This is Lydd Airport. It was a Second World War aerodrome, turned into a funny little twee airport after the war. Little tiny planes used to take 2 cars to Le Touquet. As children, I was taken there. We'd look through the fence and watch celebrities get off these little planes. But then it wanted to expand. It wanted to become Ashford International Airport and extend its runway and bring jets in. And you've got Dungeness Nature Reserve at one end of the runway and the nuclear power station just over there. So aeroplanes coming in over Lade Bay with 100,000 gulls roosting on it, over a nature reserve full of large flappy birds with a nuclear power station over there. Bad idea. So we fought that one very hard. We'd lost that one, actually. They did get permission to extend their runway. They've never used it. I don't think they've actually built it, but planning isn't about economic good sense and wisdom. I think sometimes you don't know what it's about. So we lost that one. But the pressures of air transport in the southeast of England continue. We're seeing Heathrow is coming back for another go, another second run. Yes, of course, Labour government. Of course, in the middle of a climate emergency, build a second ruddy runway. Why don't you? You know, there have been 8 proposals in the Thames to build an entire new airport. And there was one on the Hoo Peninsula at Cliff. There was another one out in the estuary, which was going to be on reclaimed land, which became known as Boris Island, after a former Mayor of London and Prime Minister. And these things flying in over coastal wetlands are at grave risk from airstrike. So why put them there? And had Cliff Airport gone ahead, not only would it have been devastating for nature, but it would have seen the biggest movement of displaced humans since the Second World War, as they had to depopulate the area to make room for the airport. So it wasn't popular. There's the view of either a goose flying in or an airliner. It wasn't popular, and we were able to mobilise quite a significant campaign with local people who were very motivated, both by the fact that their houses would disappear, but also because they saw the relevance of nature. Perhaps they didn't before. Perhaps that funny old RSPB reserve up the way where you put your dog on the lead, which was a bit of a pain in the neck, suddenly becomes an asset because we've got some common cause between the community and the conservation organisation. So again, we get that ability to bring communities into focus and into the ability to run a campaign. What happens afterwards? Leaving that hanging. What happens afterwards? How do you carry on that relationship between a special place, the community, the wildlife, and a sustainable future? I've been talking about birds. I do. RSPB, KOS, it runs in the blood. But there are some lesser creatures that deserve our respect. And I'm just popping up into Scotland to look at this one. This is a place called Cool Links. That's not a compliment to pointy-eared felines. It's an actual place. It is a coastal site on the Scottish coast, which is the only UK haunt for this chap. Fonseca's seed fly. Hands up if you've heard of Fonseca's seed fly. Splendid. I hadn't. And in fact, the only one that we could find a picture of is actually on a pin. We believe that's a youngster coming out of the seed head at the bottom. Now, it's quite easy to run a campaign when you've got 50,000 birds flying about in front of you, or some glamour-puss heron that comes and nests for the first time. It's quite a lot harder to raise concern to a level that it has political salience for Fonseca's seed fly. I mean, we've seen recently government pronouncements on we hate bats, we hate newts, NIMBYs go home. This is the government speaking. It's quite hard to build up the case for these things. The threat to Cool Links was actually for it to be turned into a golf course. An American billionaire had eyes on it. Not that one. This was a different American billionaire. And so far, the Scottish government have held firm. It has come back, and they're looking at it again. Of course, these things do. They come, and they come, and they come, and they come, until either a sustainable future is found, or everybody's so worn out that eventually everything collapses and the development goes ahead. So back to Kent, and this is the distinguished jumping spider. I usually put a warning in before I put that picture up, because some people don't like pictures of spiders. That spider is about yo big, so worry not. And it's a tiny resident of a place called the Swanscombe Peninsula. It shares it with this thing, which is the bearded reedling or the bearded tit. You know, if you're going to campaign, which is going to be your poster creature? Yeah, so getting that whole mix of why a site's important together is really important. But both of these, the bearded tit and the distinguished jumping spider, occur on the Swanscombe Peninsula. You may not have come across the Swanscombe Peninsula. If you've ever crossed the Dartford River crossing, particularly coming south, so you're going over the bridge, if you look to your left up the river, not if you're a passenger, clearly not if you're driving, you'll see two enormous electricity pylons, one in Kent and one in Essex, to get the wires across the river without catching ships. And that's the Swanscombe Peninsula. Back and beyond, forgotten, ignored, known by the locals and a few dog walkers and some naturalists. And then along comes a proposal to turn it into a Universal Studios theme park. So bye-bye wildlife, bye-bye forgotten corner of Kent, hello new mega development. So a campaign was born. And here's the really important part of it. This was a campaign from the bottom up. It wasn't some fancy Dan conservation organisation coming into a community and saying, your area is really important, it's an internationally important wildlife site, don't you know? This was local people knowing that their area was important, engaging the bird watchers, engaging the ringers, engaging the entomologists to start to find out what was there and to document it and to put that case forward to the government's nature conservation advisors, Natural England, in such a way that they were then able to designate this site as a site of special scientific interest. So it came from a scrubby old bit of nowhere up the back end of Kent through to being one of our top wildlife sites because of that campaign and that activity by local people, by local naturalists. So this is a very heartening story. And just the other day, in fact yesterday, we're seeing in the news that that proposal for that Universal Studios theme park is finally dead. So even now, even in this witheringly hard context and time for nature conservation, we can see some huge victories. The big question now, of course, is what happens to Swanscombe? Does it just go back to a few people pottering about and ringing the birds and walking the dogs, or does it turn into something more sustainable, longer-term vision for the area that respects and enhances its wildlife? How are we doing for time? Oh, I'm all right for time, a little bit. You want questions? Oh, another 10 minutes or so. So that's a car park. That's a car park on the Medway estuary. It's called Lappel Bank. And Lappel Bank was a mud flat. And it used to support breeding wading birds, things that wintered here on their way down from the Arctic to spend a few months here while the Arctic was frozen before they could go back and breed, or perhaps stopping over and feeding up on their northward migration in the spring. It was part of the Medway estuary, and it was being designated under the terms of this much mentioned Wild Birds Directive as a special protection area. That's a European designation. And the government at the time saw fit to exclude Lappel Bank and draw a line along the edge of the river rather than around the mudflat, because they wanted a car park there, a car park for importing cars, not just for people going to work, where they unload the cars. So there was a big economic driver to exclude a great chunk of the Medway estuary within the designated site. And RSPB at the time, this goes back a good few years now, this was back in the end of the last century, went, no, that's not acceptable, that's illegal. So we took the government to court and we lost. We took the government to the High Court and we lost. And then we took the government to the European Court and we won, and set a vital piece of European case law that you cannot use economic factors in determining the scientific value of a site you want to designate to protect. You have to designate it properly according to the science, and then if the overwhelming national interest is that you then build a car park to import cars on it and there is no alternative, you mitigate and compensate, but you can go ahead with the development if that is your national decision. And this sent shockwaves throughout Europe and became a really important piece of case law at European level, and also forced the UK government to find alternatives. How do you actually mend the place so that these not KNOT? I was actually out bird watching the other day, and there was a flock of birds in the distance, and somebody with me said, "Are they golden plover?" And I went, "No, they're not." And he went, "Oh, are they starlings then?" I went, "No, they're not." He said, "Well, what are they then?" It was a long story. But anyway, not KNOT, Calidris canutus, used to winter on Lappel Bank and now don't. So where do they go? Well, the government was forced to find an alternative site, and that ended up being on a place called Wallasey Island in Essex, and a new wetland was created there. Now, it's quite a long way away from where the damage was done on the Medway, but to a knot, probably just about acceptable. But what it did, it opened the idea of, well, you know, if you could do this with a tiny part of Wallasey Island, why not for the whole part? And a deal was done with Wallasey Farms, who were farming an area that they knew eventually was going to be inundated by the sea because of sea level rise and crumbling coastal defences that would never be renewed. So they did the deal and enabled RSPB and partners to establish the Wallasey Wild Coast Project. Now, why have I got a picture of the Crossrail logo up there? Well, to restore Wallasey Island to part of a functioning part of the Essex coastline, which had been lost, we needed a lot of mud. And we had a hole needing mud, and Crossrail had a hole with producing a lot of mud, and there was a marriage made in heaven. And so for several years, the mud from the Crossrail tunnel under London was boated round to Wallasey Island and deposited there and used to landform a newly created wetland. And there's some shots of it. That little sort of bite-shaped piece is the original compensation for the loss of Lappel Bank. The rest of the dark green area in the middle is Wallasey Island. And that's what it looks like now. So we've actually put back something like 1,000 hectares of coastal wetland. So it's all right protecting your special places, the stuff that we've already got, but you've got to go further. You've got to start to look at how you can restore them. And now this has become a special place. It's become certainly qualifying for designation as a special protection area. And this winter, in one of the latest counts of waterfowl on there, it had 38,000 birds on it, which is not bad for a series of arable fields that were there 15 years ago. Strange picture. But I do get ever so fed up with the sort of sterile debate. Well, protected areas, yeah, well, that's policy, rewilding. So there's all these zealots and advocates for different styles of conservation. And it's a bit like imagining a load of surgeons arguing about which is the most important bit of the body. No, it's the heart. Obviously, if the heart stops, that's it. Yes, but the brain's quite important. Well, and the kidneys. It's a stupid, facile argument to argue over the relative merits of the different approaches to nature conservation, because frankly we're in an era now where we've got to throw the kitchen sink at it. It's got to be all of these activities put together. So, a bit of ancient history for me. Most of you, some of you, won't remember the Rio Earth Summit at the end of the last century. A moment when I think we thought we were winning. I was fresh off campaigning about estuaries and getting people to believe and getting the importance of the estuaries written into the economic strategies of the northwest of England. We were getting policies in local plans and that really protected our best wildlife sites. And the Earth Summit gave birth to the Biodiversity Convention, the Climate Change Convention. All these ruddy COPs that have been going on ever since. And we thought, yes, the world's listening at last. Science is prevailing. We've given them the evidence, and now the world is at last turning to a more sustainable future. It was a high water mark, I now realise. We did sort of come tumbling down from that high water mark, but we've got to now aim for another one. So after Rio, we all went biodiversity crazy. Now, biodiversity was a word I actually loved because it was coined by one of my heroes, Edward O. Wilson, the ant specialist and author and luminary. So I quite like biodiversity, biological diversity, not just between species, but within species, the whole thing. It was a great word, but to most people it sounded like a new detergent. And it just did not sell into the public mind very effectively. And it's still there as a term that is both great and difficult to sell. But we spent ages working with local authorities and all our partner organisations and local communities to build up great strategies for, in this case, the northwest of England. And they were too complicated in the end. They worked brilliantly for certain range-restricted rare species where you could put effort in to create habitat for them. But they don't work at all well for stuff in the wider countryside. So if you're a bittern, rare heron, you need 20 hectares of rich, food-rich reed bed full of fish that it can eat. And if you create 20, 40, 60, 80 hectares, you can get 4 pairs of bitterns. And you just keep creating reed bed, you get more bitterns. And yes, we're winning, we all went. But for most species, it doesn't work like that. And of course, it started to hit the headwinds. It started to get the economic agenda going, oh, well, we can't build houses if you find newts. We can't do anything, it's got bats. We've lost 95% of this stuff. Give us a break. And so the pressures to get the policies through that would develop these strategies were just too much. And we had some great times. We wrote some beautiful documents, Action for Sustainability in Northwest England, Framework for a Better Quality of Life, totally aspirational. Had local politicians, MPs, everybody lined up behind these, saying all the right words. And it got so far, but it then hit the mud and we stopped. And I was even writing influential booklets, an Action for Biodiversity in Northwest England. Oh, how I love that word. Government Office for the Northwest, they don't exist. Northwest Biodiversity Forum still exists. Northwest Regional Assembly, that doesn't exist. So we invented the conservation strategy for the time, and we're having to do that again. and that's what we're facing. But the combination of data, bottom-up community campaigning, the fact that nothing brings people together better than a threat are all factors that very much play in today. And of course, a lot of this is based on the so-called Lawton Review. There's Sir John Lawton, a doer Yorkshireman. I knew him a bit. He was chairman of council at RSPB for many years. Oh, aye, lad, no, you've got to make a bigger, better, more connected. That's what you've got to do. And he was absolutely right. We cannot live by protected areas alone. It's been a large area of my work, and I live and die with the view that they are central to what we have to do in the future. But on their own, they will fail unless they are bigger, better managed, and better connected. So they're a stepping stone. They're a totem. They're something that people can get behind. In Canterbury, we've got an SSSI for some acidic grassland. It does not set the pulse racing. Even when you're there, you look at it and you go, yeah, it just looks like a field. But it's surrounded by an area called Old Park and Chequers Wood, which is really rich in stuff. It's got a rare broom rape in it. It's got turtle doves. It's got nightingales aplenty. It's a fantastic area in the heart of Canterbury. And it's, again, bottom up. Threats came and the community got behind it and brought in other organisations to start to campaign for it. It's now up for sale because the Ministry of Defence owned a lot of it, and they now want to flog it because they can't build houses on it, so it's not much use to them. So its future is still under something of a cloud, but the good thing is that the driving force for the future of that area is the local community. And these are the good and positive things that I think will come through. So for these birds, marsh tit, lesser-spotted woodpecker, turtle dove, cuckoo, these are not species for which we should be having to set up protected areas. They should be common birds across the wider countryside. So there's a whole suite of wildlife that should not be confined to these special places, these sites of special scientific interest, where only special people can go as scientists. We've got to democratise this much more and get people much more involved in it all. And a little trailer for the work we're doing at KOS, and this is very much not the protected area thing. We have got what we call in the data business a shit ton of data at the KOS, gathered over 70 years in many and various ways, now mainly, almost entirely coming in electronically, mainly through the British Structural Ornithology's Bird Track and through Cornell University's eBird, but through other means as well. So 500,000 records a year, which is a lot of records. What do we do with those? Well, we produce a report and summarise it all, but we must do more with that. We must get that data out there. And this is some preliminary work looking at farmland birds. So the brighter the dot, the red dots and orange dots are richer in the mix of farmland birds in the wider countryside. So this is way outside the agenda of protecting these sites as designated, as places that are designated and protected through that mechanism. But they are equally important. So how does a local planning authority deal with this disaggregated data in a way that can help them make decisions over housing, for example, or for solar farm development, or probably just down the road, more wind developments? And you can see that the data is patchy. We've got a lot more work to do to clarify this. But I don't know, you can still hear me now? But up the Stour Valley, down the coast here, up in North Kent, down on the marsh down here, there's some clear aggregations of farmland birds which are clearly more important than some of the other areas. There's some data deficit areas around that. We will continue to work on it. One of the things we want to do is encourage people to get out into those places less visited. It's great visiting the big nature reserves, but we know they're important, and just adding more and more records to those sites just confirms their importance. But these areas between them are so important. So we'll be publishing this data later this year. We'll be making it available to the planning authorities in planning authority chunks, so that we can start to put some flesh on the bones of the concerns of local people. Well, this area is really important. A little anecdote from Suffolk from years ago. We got a letter from a concerned RSPB member about an area called Kiln Meadow. Just a field, and he said, but one year it had 5,000 toads in it. And we went, 5,000 toads? That's a lot. Wasn't designated, had got nobody loved it, and it was scheduled for housing. And the local resident said, well, can you write a letter to the planning authority and tell them not to, please? And we went, well, it's not a designated site, so it doesn't really fulfil our criteria. And so we got into a little bit of a tiz about our rules. Anyway, this member then turned up at the AGM where the aforementioned John Lawton was actually chairing our AGM. And they stood up and said, well, we couldn't get RSPB to support our campaign to save Kiln Meadow and the 5,000 toads. And there was a pause, and John Lawton looked at our chief executive and went, well, that's outrageous, mate. Why on earth, why aren't you doing that? It's really important. These linkages between protected areas, really important. You've got to do more about this. So anyway, we sent a letter to the local planning authority, and to cut a long story short, Kiln Meadow and the toads were saved. So the big conservation organisations will always focus on the big prestigious sites, because if we lose those, we're losing so much. We haven't got the resources to be everywhere, do everything. But empowering people through local nature initiatives, Local Agenda 21, as it was called after the Rio Earth Summit, is the future. It's absolutely key. So I'm very keen that we could introduce the data flow from KOS and from other places. We've done this jointly with the Biological Records Centre to introduce that into the whole E3 work, and I'm very much looking forward to helping do that. So that's my lot. There's the big KOS logo. There's my blue sky handle. I'm moving. I am still on Twitter, as I still insist on calling it, but I know every time I tweet an angel dies. So we're all moving to blue sky. Thank you very much for listening to me. And if there's any questions, happy to field them. Thank you.